Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories.
It was a serene Thursday afternoon, the kind of calm that only the wealthiest district in the city could offer. The sun bathed the manicured lawns in a golden hue, while the distant chirping of birds filled the air, blending with the soft murmur of trickling fountains. The air smelled faintly of freshly trimmed hedges and imported roses, a perfect postcard scene of tranquility. A sleek navy blue car cruised down the long, private driveway of a sprawling mansion. Stepping out of the vehicle was Elliot Harrison, 33, a man whose sharp jawline and clean-shaven face exuded a sense of power and control. Dressed in a perfectly tailored blue suit, he walked toward the front door with the kind of confidence that only wealth could bestow. In one hand, he gripped a sleek leather briefcase, the weight of his day already heavy on his mind. Mergers, deals, client dinners, and the next billion-dollar move circled in his thoughts. Everything was falling into place just as it should, but as his hand reached for the ornate handle of the door, a voice pierced the silence, halting him mid-motion. "Stop! Don't open it!" The sudden scream shattered the quiet, sending a jolt of surprise through Elliot. Elliot spun around, his heart racing, his mind scrambling to process the sudden interruption. Standing before him, barefoot and frantic, was a small black boy, no older than 7. His khaki shirt was drenched in sweat, dirt smudging his pale white trousers, and in his hand he clutched a crumpled yellow hat like a lifeline. His wide eyes flickered with desperation as he panted, his tiny feet slapping against the pavement with each panicked step. "Sir, please, don't go in there." The words tumbled out of his mouth in a desperate, strangled cry. Elliot blinked in confusion, still frozen, his hand hovering just inches from the door. "What are you talking about? This is private property." But the boy was relentless, stepping closer with every word, his voice trembling as he spoke faster, almost choking on the urgency. "You can't go in. They planted something inside the house. Please, I'm telling you the truth." Elliot's skepticism flared. This had to be some sort of prank. But as the boy's lips quivered and his tear-filled eyes locked with his, something in Elliot's gut twisted. This wasn't a game. "Who planted what?" Elliot demanded, now on edge. The boy's gaze darted nervously behind him, as though fearing someone might be watching. 2 men. They were wearing black hoodies. "They broke in last night. I saw them. I was sleeping behind your trash cans. They didn't see me," he continued, his voice cracking as he relayed the grim tale. The weight of the situation began to sink in. This was no ordinary warning. Elliot's pulse quickened, a cold shiver creeping up his spine as he listened intently. "What did they do?" he asked, his voice tight with rising tension. The boy's breath hitched, and his voice faltered as he spoke, the words hanging heavy in the air. "They said, 'The rich always win, but tonight he won't wake up.' Then one of them put something near the front entrance. It beeped. I heard it." Elliot's hand froze, just inches from the door. A chilling realization struck him. This was no ordinary threat. He stepped back slowly, his mind racing. His hand gripped the briefcase tighter as if it could steady him, but the unease gnawed at him, relentless. His instincts screamed to call security, to dismiss the boy as some desperate scam artist. But the raw panic in the child's voice, the trembling of his lips, stopped him. "What kind of something?" Elliot pressed, stepping further away from the door. The boy looked around nervously, as though afraid to speak too freely, before whispering, "A bomb. They planted a bomb." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. His gaze flickered to the ornate handle he had been about to turn, the door that had nearly led him straight into death. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, his mind racing as he dialed 911. "Get here now," he barked, his voice strained. "There's a bomb in my house." Within minutes, sirens screamed in the distance, but all Elliot could think about was the child before him, whose quick thinking and fearless warning had saved him from a fate worse than death. As Elliot stood in front of his mansion, the weight of what had just happened sank in like a crushing wave. His eyes, once filled with the certainty of his wealth and success, were now hollow, staring off into the distance. A homeless child, dirty, trembling, and with nothing but a crumpled yellow hat to call his own, had saved his life. Elliot couldn't comprehend the twist of fate. How had this boy, living on the streets, become the one to keep him from dying? The question gnawed at him, the realization unsettling in its simplicity. But then, As the police cordoned off the area and officers swarmed the property, another thought crept into his mind. Who would want him dead? It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. 6 months ago, his company, Harrison Development Group, had secured a contract to build luxury condos in a neighborhood that had long been home to families who had nowhere else to go. With every new development came displaced families, broken communities, and shattered lives. He had been too focused on the money, the expansion, the endless climb to notice the damage it caused. He had ignored the protests, dismissed the letters of concern, and turned a blind eye to the cries of the very people whose lives had been uprooted. Among those displaced was Victor Grant, an ex-electrician who had lost everything: his home, his wife, and even the custody of his young son. Victor had come to Elliot's office once, begging for compensation, pleading for some form of justice for the pain his family had endured. But Elliot, too busy with mergers and profits, had him escorted out. The memory of Victor's face, desperate and broken, suddenly resurfaced, twisting Elliot's gut in ways no business deal ever had. And now, the truth came crashing down. The two masked intruders, Victor and an accomplice, had planned to send a message to remind Elliot and the world that actions had consequences. But what they hadn't planned for, what they hadn't seen, was a child sleeping behind a trash bin, listening, watching, and understanding more than anyone had ever given him credit for. Max Jackson, the boy who had saved him, wasn't just a homeless child with no future. He was a witness to a cruel world, and somehow he had been the one to break through to Elliot. As the officers swarmed the property, the chaos unfolding around him felt distant to Elliot Harrison, whose thoughts were consumed by the boy sitting quietly at the edge of the garden steps. Max Jackson, his small frame hunched, still gripped the crumpled yellow hat, a symbol of his past, of the street he had come from. Elliot watched him, the weight of guilt settling on his chest like an unbearable burden. He approached slowly, his feet heavy, his mind still struggling to grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred. Kneeling beside Max, he gazed at the boy with a mix of awe and confusion. "Why'd you help me?" Elliot's voice cracked, his words laced with something raw, something vulnerable. Max lifted his gaze, his eyes tired, distant, as if he had seen too much to ever truly be a child again. He shrugged slightly, his small shoulders rising and falling with the motion, before answering in a voice barely above a whisper, "You look nice in the picture." Elliot blinked, taken aback by the simple response. "What picture?" he asked, his mind racing. Max reached into the tattered pocket of his trousers, pulling out a soggy, folded newspaper page. With trembling fingers, he held it out to Elliot. The headline was faded, but it was unmistakable. The photograph, a smiling image of Elliot Harrison, his arm around a child at a charity gala, his face beaming as he presented a giant donation check. It was a photograph Elliot barely remembered, one of the many hollow PR stunts, a fleeting attempt to soften his image after the backlash over his company's dealings. But Max remembered. The boy who had never been given a second glance, the boy who had nothing, had held on to that moment like it was his lifeline. "I used to live there," Max whispered, the weight of the words sinking into Elliot's chest. For a long moment, there was only silence, thick and heavy, as Elliot stared at the article, the paper trembling in his hand. It was as if the boy, this ragged child with dirt-streaked skin and a heart too heavy for his age, had opened a door Elliot hadn't even known was there. The tears in Max's eyes, the same eyes that had warned him of danger, that had saved him, spoke volumes. This wasn't a child simply reacting out of kindness. It was a boy who had known pain, who had lived a life Elliot had only seen in passing. Max's voice broke the silence. "I kept it. I kept it because you looked happy." The words hung in the air, and Elliot felt his world shift in ways he couldn't explain. The world of wealth, business deals, and luxury condos felt so far removed from this simple truth. Elliot stood up slowly, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He called to one of the officers nearby, his voice steady now, but with a deep sense of urgency. "I want this boy taken care of, immediately. Food, clothes, a medical checkup, everything." Max looked up at him, his wide eyes full of surprise. "You're not mad at me?" Elliot knelt again, his hand gently gripping Max's shoulder. "No, kid," he said softly, his voice breaking with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "You saved my life." Behind them, the arrest of Victor Grant, who had been found trying to flee the city, unfolded in a blur of flashing lights and shouting officers. Elliot watched as Victor was dragged past, still struggling, yelling with all his might. I begged you. I begged you for help. My son is gone because of you. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Elliot didn't see a criminal. He saw a broken man, lost, desperate, consumed by the destruction Elliot's company had left in its wake. But what Victor didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elliot had lost something too. 3 years ago, his younger brother had died, homeless, addicted, abandoned. Elliot had been too late, just as he had been too late to understand the cost of his decisions. All the wealth, all the success in the world hadn't been enough to save him. And now, standing here, facing a boy who had saved his life, Elliot felt the crushing weight of that truth. For the first time, Elliot truly saw the cost of his actions. And in that moment, as Max sat silently beside him, the bond between them, born out of pain, guilt, and a fleeting moment of connection, began to shift something deep inside him. Elliot stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything pressing down on him, his thoughts tangled in guilt and disbelief. The world around him buzzed with the activity of officers and flashing lights, but all he could focus on was the boy, Max, who had saved his life. Elliot could hardly comprehend the gravity of the moment. A homeless child, no older than 7, had spared him from certain death, and now he had nothing but a crumpled yellow hat and a look of quiet determination in his eyes. He took a step closer to Max, whose small form sat motionless on the edge of the garden steps. The boy was still clutching the hat, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to this world, to something solid, something real. The quiet stillness between them was heavy, and for the first time, Elliot realized that the boy who had pulled him back from the edge wasn't just an orphan. He was a reflection of everything Elliot had failed to see. Elliot bent down, kneeling beside him. His voice was soft, but filled with an overwhelming mix of gratitude and confusion. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his words barely breaking the silence. Max looked up slowly, his gaze piercing. He didn't answer right away, as if weighing the question, and when he finally did, it was in a tone so quiet it was almost a whisper. "You look nice in the picture," he said simply, his voice heavy with something Elliot couldn't understand. "What picture?" Elliot blinked, momentarily taken aback by the response. Max reached into his pocket, pulling out the same soggy, wrinkled newspaper page. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed it over, and Elliot took it cautiously. The article was old, the ink slightly faded, but the image was unmistakable. It was of Elliot, smiling at a charity event, holding a massive donation check in front of a crowd. Elliot's mind flickered back to that night, another one of his company's PR stunts, designed to soften his public image, to quiet the critics who had torn apart his latest venture. "I used to live there," Max said softly, his voice barely audible. The words hit Elliot harder than any bomb. The charity event he had barely remembered, the one where he had shown up with a check and left with the satisfaction of his own image intact, had meant something entirely different to this boy. To Max, it was a sign of hope, a glimmer of kindness in a life filled with shadows. The silence that followed stretched on, thick with realization. Max had kept that picture tucked away in his pocket, a reminder of something he had clung to for comfort, for belief in something better. And here Elliot was, too caught up in his own world to ever notice. Max had seen him as more than just a wealthy businessman. To Max, Elliot represented something he had never had, the chance to make a difference, to care, to help. Elliot's chest tightened as the weight of the boy's trust and innocence settled over him. He stood up, his hand trembling slightly as he called over one of the officers. "I want this boy taken care of. Immediately. Food, clothes, medical checkup, everything." Max looked up at him with wide, wary eyes, as if unsure what to make of Elliot's sudden kindness. "You're not mad at me?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Elliot knelt down again, this time his hand gently resting on Max's shoulder. His voice was firm, but the emotion that ran through it was raw and real. "No, kid, you saved my life. You've got nothing to apologize for." Behind them, Victor Grant was being dragged away by officers, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Elliot watched as Victor was pulled past, shouting curses and accusations at him, but this time, Elliot didn't feel anger. For the first time, he saw Victor for what he truly was, a broken man, beaten down by a system that had never cared about him. The realization hit hard. Elliot had been so focused on building his empire, on climbing higher, that he had lost sight of everything that mattered. He had ignored the people who suffered, the ones who had been crushed by his success. But Victor had lost everything: his home, his family, his dignity. And in a way, Elliot had lost too. 3 years ago, his younger brother had died on the streets, homeless, addicted, abandoned. Elliot had been too late to save him, just as he had been too late to understand the consequences of his own actions. All the wealth in the world hadn't been enough to bring him back. But now, standing here with Max, who had somehow seen beyond all the wealth and power, Elliot realized that this was the second chance he had been given. Max had saved him, not just from the bomb in his house, but from a life that had been spiraling out of control without him even knowing it. And now, for the first time, Elliot saw what truly mattered. The night stretched on, the chaos of the day now quieting into a peaceful stillness that felt oddly unnatural. Elliot sat beside Max on the garden steps, the soft glow of the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. It was a silence that carried weight, the kind of silence that fills a room with unspoken words and untold stories. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. His mind replayed the events over and over: the bomb, the boy's warning, and the truth that had come crashing down on him like a storm. He had been given a second chance at life. But what did he do with it? Max sat beside him, still clutching the yellow hat, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He stared out into the night, lost in his own thoughts, a quiet sadness in his eyes that Elliot couldn't ignore. The boy, so young, had seen more of the world's darkness than most people would in a lifetime. Elliot wondered how a child so small could carry so much pain. His heart tightened as he looked at Max, who had somehow managed to hold on to a piece of innocence amid the harshness of his world. Elliot broke the silence, his voice softer than he intended. "What if I hadn't listened?" he asked, the question lingering in the air like a heavy breath. It was a thought that had been gnawing at him all day. What if he had just opened the door? What if he hadn't paid attention to the warning, to the small voice of a child who had nothing but his instinct and a desperate hope? Max didn't answer right away. He simply hugged his knees tighter, the faintest tremble in his body as he stared at the ground. After a moment, he looked up at Elliot, his eyes steady, but filled with a wisdom far beyond his years. "Sometimes people don't listen until it's too late," he said quietly, his voice carrying a depth of truth that struck Elliot like a punch to the gut. The words hung in the air, echoing in Elliot's mind. Too late. That was the fear, wasn't it? That the world would keep moving, indifferent to his actions, until the consequences were irreversible. But somehow, this boy, this child who had nothing, had managed to make him see. Elliot's gaze softened as he looked at Max, really looked at him for the first time. The boy's clothes were ragged, his skin worn by the elements, but there was something in his eyes, a strength that Elliot had missed before. In that moment, Elliot understood. Max wasn't just a child who had saved his life. He was a reminder of everything Elliot had forgotten. The world wasn't about power, wealth, or control. It was about listening, about seeing the people who needed to be seen. Elliot stood up slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He reached out a hand to Max, who looked up in surprise. The boy hesitated for a moment, then, as if making a decision, placed his small hand in Elliot's. There was no hesitation now, no fear. It was a simple act, but it felt like the beginning of something far greater. "Come on," Elliot said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's go inside." Max stood up slowly, still holding on to the yellow hat like it was the only thing tying him to the world. As they walked toward the house, Elliot felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about saving a life. It was about saving each other, about finding redemption in the most unlikely of places. And when they crossed the threshold of the house, it wasn't just Max who stepped into a new world. It was Elliot too. A world where the things that mattered weren't the ones he had once chased, but the ones he had ignored. A world where listening, really listening, was the key to everything. Days passed, but time felt different now. Elliot watched as Max settled into the life that had once seemed so far out of reach, a life with food, warmth, and safety. The house, once a fortress of solitude and excess, began to feel like a home. But more than the material comforts, it was the little things that began to matter. Max's stories of the streets, the names of children he had met along the way he smiled when he found a half-forgotten toy hidden in the attic. These small moments, once invisible to Elliot, now felt like pieces of a puzzle he had long neglected to see. Max became the center of this new world, not just as a child who needed care, but as someone who had shown Elliot the value of compassion, of connection. Elliot found himself listening, really listening, as Max shared his stories about the people he had met on the streets, the children who had taken shelter in abandoned buildings, the meals they'd shared, the nights spent huddled together for warmth. Every word, every detail, painted a picture of a life Elliot had never known, a world hidden beneath the glossy surface of his own existence. Max spoke with a quiet strength, a resilience that went unnoticed by most. But to Elliot, each word was a revelation, each story a lesson in humanity. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Max was flipping through an old photo album. His fingers brushed over the pictures, lingering on the ones that seemed to mean the most to him. There was one of a boy, around Max's age, smiling beside a tree. The photo was worn, edges frayed, but there was a light in the boy's eyes that reminded Elliot of the innocence Max still carried within him. Max traced the photo with his finger, a faint sadness in his gaze. "I used to have a friend," he said quietly. "He didn't make it, though. He got lost. I never saw him again." Elliot's heart ached at the words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick. Max simply nodded, not needing to say more. In that silence, Elliot understood something deeper. Max had lost so much, but somehow he still held on to hope. It was that hope that had saved him, that had led him to reach out to Elliot when no one else had. The more Elliot listened, the more he realized that this was the real work. This was where he needed to start. It wasn't just about saving one boy. It was about creating something that would last, something that would protect and nurture kids like Max, who had been forgotten by the world. He couldn't undo the harm his company had caused, but he could build something better, something that would truly make a difference. Elliot's mind began to turn, fueled by the stories Max had shared. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer, his accountant, and his team. The plan began to take shape, a new approach to charity, to giving back, not as a publicity stunt, but as a real investment in the future. He would reopen the orphanage he had once donated to, but this time, it wouldn't be just about money. It would be about care, about offering a safe haven for children like Max, children who had been cast aside, forgotten by society. He would build a trauma wing, hire real caregivers, and make sure that these children had a chance to rebuild their lives, just as Max had a chance to rebuild his. And as he worked tirelessly on the plans, one thing became abundantly clear. Max wasn't just a boy who needed help. He was the heart of this new mission. Elliot had once thought he was the one giving back, the one in control, but now he understood that Max had given him more than he could ever repay. Max had opened his eyes to a world beyond his own, a world that had always existed, just waiting to be seen. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Elliot stood before a press conference, his heart pounding in his chest. The cameras flashed. The reporters waited eagerly for the next big announcement from the successful businessman. But this time, Elliot wasn't here to talk about profits or new developments. He was here for something else, something that was bigger than any deal he had ever signed. "I'd like to introduce you all to my son," Elliot said, his voice strong, clear, and full of emotion. He placed his hand gently on Max's shoulder, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was standing in the right place. "I didn't adopt him out of guilt or gratitude. I did it because, for the first time, someone saw me for more than my money, and I saw someone who deserved more than this world had ever given him." Max looked up at him, his eyes shining with a mix of surprise and quiet joy. He was no longer just the homeless boy who had saved Elliot's life. He was his son, his family, and the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, was now a home, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of a future they would build together. As they walked out of the press conference, hand in hand, Elliot looked at Max with a sense of pride and wonder. This was where it had all led. The house, The money, the success. It had all been a preparation for this moment, for the boy who had saved him in more ways than one. And now, as father and son, they would walk into a world that, for the first time, seemed full of possibility.